why don't we just dismiss epidemiology? Because there are questions that you can't ask with randomized controlled trials. You can't ask if smoking leads to lung cancer over 30 or 40 years with a randomized controlled trial, because you can't randomize people to smoke and then follow them for 30 years. It's just not doable.
Welcome to the Proof Podcast, a space for science-based conversation exploring the health and longevity benefits that come with mastering nutrition, physical exercise, mindfulness, recovery, sleep, and alignment. Facts, nuance, and trustworthy recommendations, minus the hyperbole. Hello, my friends. Welcome back. Great to be here with you. I'm your host, Simon Hill. I'm a qualified physiotherapist and nutritionist with an undergraduate science degree and a master's in the science of human nutrition. In my career, I've worked with many people, including elite professional athletes, to improve their health, performance, and longevity. And I'm currently involved in research with a group of nutrition scientists in Australia looking at dietary patterns and mental health. Today I sit down with Dr Gil Carvalho, or Gil as many know him by. He's a physician, research scientist, science communicator, speaker, and writer. He trained as a medical doctor at the University of Lisbon and later obtained a PhD in biology. Gil has published peer-reviewed medical research spanning the fields of genetics, molecular biology, nutrition, behavior, aging, and neuroscience, and has a really wonderful YouTube channel called Nutrition Made Simple, where he goes through regular points of confusion and is able to discuss quite sophisticated and nuanced information in what I think is a very accessible and empowering manner. In this conversation, we focus less on what to think and more on how to think about the science of human nutrition. In particular, we cover Gil's framework, the 3 Ps, that he uses to evaluate evidence and dispel confusion. And then we walk through a few examples using this framework, including cooking oils and red meat. If you're wanting to improve your ability to think about nutrition research and come to well-informed positions, or are just simply interested in hearing how a highly regarded research scientist thinks and evaluates evidence, then I'm sure there's a lot that you'll take from this episode. Please do enjoy, and I'll catch you on the other side. Welcome to the show, Gil. It's been a long time coming, this one. I think probably years in the making. So I'm certainly super excited to have you on and get the chance to share your wisdom with the listeners.
Thanks for having me, man. It's a pleasure.
I've got to say at the outset here, over the years, the sort of list of health professionals who I refer people to when they ask me answers to certain questions that I perhaps don't have on hand or haven't covered in detail, that list has become more and more refined over time. But you are certainly right up there at the top of that list as one of the sources of information that I just have so much respect for. I love the way that you think about science. I love the way that you communicate it. So I guess I just wanted to start this conversation by thanking you for all of your work and the example you set. It's really inspiring. Thanks,
man. I really appreciate that. I'm just learning as I go along and trying to get better at communicating science. We unfortunately don't get a lot of background, a lot of training in that area when we either medical school or grad school. It's all this kind of like talking to other specialists and this arcane mode of speech, right? It doesn't lend itself very well to talking to the public. And so I have to say it's been almost like another road of learning on top of like the basic science. Learning how to communicate with people, how to break things down. They say that teaching is learning twice, right? And I've really found that a lot of times I'll start making a video and I think I understand the topic, and then it'll go through so many iterations and so many versions because we keep looking at the video and going, this is not simple enough. It's still too convoluted. Let's break this down more. And by the end, I end up having to look into a lot of details and really consolidate things in my mind. And I end up understanding the topic better by making the videos than I thought I did in the beginning. So it's a two-way process.
It's so true. It's so true. Yeah. It's a way to stress test your understanding of a topic. How well can you explain it to someone who doesn't have any real background knowledge about that topic? You mentioned road, and your sort of road or journey background is somewhat unique. You're a medical doctor and a scientist. an MD and a PhD. So you have this beautiful blend of clinical experience, but also experience with data and making sense of evidence. Walk me through this journey of yours. So how did all of that kind of unfold and come about?
So I started out wanting to go into medicine and the clinical side. And I spent my teens in Portugal. And here you start medical school right after high school. So you're like 18 when you start basically functioning out almost as a doctor in the hospital. So you're very young. And throughout medical school, my mind changed a number of times, and you mature, you change your mind. And I ended up deciding towards the end that I wanted to get a more robust background in the science itself and do research into all these different topics. And so I then applied to and got into grad school. And that's when I moved to the US. I went to Caltech in the LA area and spent another several years doing research full time. And then after that, I did research for another number of years. Overall, I've been doing research for maybe like close to 20 years now, full time. Basically, all my adult life after med school. And then after that was the kind of the third chapter, which was, I think everything came together very nicely when I ended up blending all those backgrounds together like I want. I love interacting with people. And so just the research, I lacked the human side. And then just the medicine, I lacked more the research and the hardcore, like hyper nerdy side of researching something in depth, right? And really figuring out those details. So the science communication thing that I now devote most of my time to ended up blending all those things together very nicely. Mm-hmm. So I think it's a good fit for me, but I'll let the audience be the judge of that.
So the science that you were originally sort of interested in and involved with was more biomedical science. Is that right? Yeah,
I initially was interested in aging, so the biology of aging, biogerontology. Mm-hmm. And that's what I did. My PhD started out with an interest in the biology of aging, the mechanisms, the genetics, and the biochemistry of the aging process using model organisms, basically lab animals, right? Mm-hmm. And we used a lot of insects, a lot of fruit flies, some worms and stuff. And then because aging is connected to food, a lot of the interventions that have been shown to extend lifespan are related to nutrition and nutrient sensing pathways. A lot of the work we did was related to foods and different nutrients and how different nutrients affect physiology and how they extend or shorten life. This was like a daily discussion in the lab. And so we ended up doing a lot of stuff on nutrition, on that mechanistic side of nutrition with model organisms. And a lot of my PhD ended up being, the thesis and everything ended up being nutritional effects on different physiological aspects and aging lifespan. So that was the background. Then I fused that with the human side. Obviously, my interest in the human biology coming from medical school, I always had in mind the application to humans of all these basic mechanisms that we were uncovering.
Mm. Do you find that you can just take your approach to science from that sort of more deeper biology kind of level and it just translates perfectly to nutrition science? Or are there some stark differences that you really had to go away and learn in order to make sense of nutrition science, which you can speak to, but obviously has, of course, some fairly large differences in terms of the way science is conducted and what you can and cannot sort of ask and the answers you can get?
I think the foundation is the same. The basic principles are the same. And then there's an aspect of specificity to the field, which I think happens in any field. And with nutrition, I don't think that's an exception. There's certainly a lot of knowledge that comes specifically from studying nutrition. So I think it all sits on a foundation of just scientific interpretation and scientific background. But yes, I have lots of colleagues that do other things, and nutrition confuses them almost as much as sometimes more than your average layperson. So yeah, you do need both the background, just the kind of the backbones, right? The structure where then the specific knowledge sits. And you do need that specific knowledge, because otherwise it would be like me trying to understand, cancer biology or even another field of science like astronomy or physics. It would take me a long time to get up to speed. That's just the way it is.
So you mentioned confusion there, and today you spend quite a bit of time putting together these videos on YouTube, discussing common areas of confusion when it comes to nutrition and dispelling myths by showing people how to think, not just what to think, which is where I kind of want to start this conversation. How you think as someone reviewing the science and the sort of framework or system that you use for appraising scientific evidence and dispelling confusion. And in talking to you, I know that you've simplified this into a kind of 3 Ps system. And I thought perhaps here you could walk us through this, why you think it's important that we're thinking about how we form our views, and then that can kind of set us up for the remainder of the conversation, where we jump into a few of these specific points of confusion that come up time and time again.
Yeah, I love that you said the how and not just the what, right? I think about that all the time, and I think that was the motivating factor for me to start making videos and publish them. And I often think, sometimes I've said that in videos before, but the point of the videos, ostensibly it's about nutrition, but the reality is that they're about critical thinking and how to figure out how to navigate through a confusing world of seemingly contradictory information. And this, I've often thought that the channel could have been about many other fields of research. I did neuroscience for 7 or 8 years as a research scientist, and it could have been about neuroscience. It could have been on genetics. It ended up being on nutrition because I have a personal interest in it. I have some background in it, and it's something that I think the application is very important to people. But what the videos are really about for me is the how, is that heuristic process. And I think, this couldn't be more topical, right? We are in the middle of a tsunami of this discussion is like now we're in the middle of it with all the Joe Rogan controversies, all the the infodemic, the pandemic or disinformation, all of these controversies. And it's not specific to the virus. Obviously, the virus brought this all to the surface, but we were seeing this with vaccines before. We were seeing this with climate change. We know that this is a daily reality with nutrition. And so I think the general mental hygiene of being able to navigate a question and find reliable information and answers is a crucial life skill nowadays that applies to all of these different fields. And so to specifically address this, so we were talking about this, we were just shooting the breeze, talking about these different questions and what we could, how we could bring value to people. And I think the thought process is that people who have a scientific training and a system of critical thinking are much less prone to confusion when exposed to certain types of content. Like if you or I watch a video by somebody just making outlandish claims on nutrition, it's much harder to confuse you or me. And that's not because we are smarter. It's not even because we have a scientific background per se. It's that we have a certain way of thinking that breaks down the arguments that are being made, and then a certain a posteriori process of fact-checking. And so I've been thinking about this for a long time. How can we break this down and distill the essential principles so that anybody without scientific training can do this and can hit the key buttons without having to spend, years digging and reading every paper on Earth? So this simple system that we came up with, we called it the 3 Ps of fact-checking, or the 3 Ps of information, clarity, whatever you want to call it. The first P stands for proof, And that's kind of self-explanatory, but basically it's a very important realization that the burden of proof is with the person making the claim. Crucial. People contact me every day with videos or blogs or posts that they say they're very confused by. And a lot of times it's just a claim with no evidence to back it up. Right?
Do you have an example of some sort of claim that could be made that is related to this?
Yeah, I mean, this happens 10 times a day. So from lectins will kill you, so you shouldn't eat beans, to whole grains are toxic because of something that happens in the gut, to some stuff with the vaccines and the pandemic and COVID. Don't take the vaccine because it will increase your risk of getting sick. It will spread. It's the vaccinated people that are spreading the disease. There are countless examples of claims that are made that confuse people, that don't even that are unaccompanied by evidence. Right? And so this first step of proof is just that mindset shift of a claim without evidence. I mean, I might as well be reading Harry Potter, right? It's like talking about my favorite color. It's like sitting there and going, my favorite color is blue. Cool. Mine is green, whatever. Right? You have to show evidence. It's not on the person receiving the message to then go fact check what you're saying just to find out if it's evidence-based or not. So even though this sounds very obvious, the truth is it disqualifies automatic DQ on like 90% of the content out there that seems very confusing to people. So to make this clearer, what does proof look like? Normally, it's going to be a peer-reviewed study in a medical journal. Not always. If you're citing a statistic, for example, right, it could be a reputable website, it could be a poll, it could be some source of that number, of that stat. But most of the time, it's going to be a published, peer-reviewed source. Those aren't perfect, as we know. But that's where the rest of the piece come in. But it's a start. It's reliable. We're in a terrain where we can start working. We can start talking about it. We can start the conversation. Conversely, some things that are often brought up to validate these claims that are not proof. Anecdotes are not proof. I stopped eating food XYZ and I now feel better. My health improved. That's not proof. We can go into the whys, but there's a lot of factors around anecdotes. All the confounders. There's many things many variables. There's no way to control for those variables. There's placebo effect. There's 1,000 reasons why an anecdote is not a compelling. It doesn't mean the anecdote is irrelevant for the person experiencing it.
Can we pause on that for one second? You mentioned there's no way of controlling for variables. Can you just break that down? I think that's a really important point for people to understand when it comes to anecdotes.
Yeah, most of the time when somebody tries to make a point that they eliminated a certain food, this happens all the time on social media. You'll post a study showing benefit or showing harm of certain food, and somebody will disagree and say, well, actually, in my experience, I eliminated that food and I felt better. Or I eliminated that food I added that food and I felt worse. And the problem with that, it doesn't mean that it's wrong. It could be right. There's a few problems. One is that it doesn't necessarily reflect what happens to the majority of people. If I'm allergic to strawberries, I could have a really bad reaction to them. Doesn't mean that they're harmful for humans. So we have to be very careful with the extrapolation, right? The anecdote could be correct and yet not be informative for the majority of people. The second problem is the confounders. Normally, people are talking about a dietary change that happened over medium to long term, but there were a number of changes happening in that person's life. They changed a lot of other things around their diet. They changed maybe their exercise. They changed stress levels. All of these things. The problem is when you run a scientific experiment, you're trying to isolate the variable, meaning you're trying to keep all the other factors as constant as you can. With the anecdote, by definition, you can't do that. You can't isolate the variable so that you can have a reasonable basis to infer causality, right? To infer that there's cause and effect between that variable and something else. I can give you a concrete example that happens all the time. When we post a study showing benefit of liquid vegetable oil, there's now this huge movement of oil is harmful, it's toxic. Some people refer to it as seed oil. Basically, liquid vegetable oils, not olive oil, but all the others: sesame oil, canola,
soybean,
flour. Yeah. So every time I or one of us posts a study showing some benefit of these oils, somebody will pop up and say, "Well, actually, I removed seed oils from my diet, and my health is much better now." And usually, when you dig into that and ask follow-up questions, what they did was they removed ultra-processed foods, junk foods. Right? They lost weight, their health improved, and then they back rationalized that because seed oils are a common component of many of these foods, then they ascribed kind of arbitrarily the blame on that nutrient. I don't think we need to spend too much time debunking that. I think most people see through that argument. And if you don't, you could just flip it to a food that you don't care about, that you have no emotional feelings towards, and you will immediately see the problem, right? You could just as well hypothesize that it was protein, because protein is included in most ultra-processed foods, or some mineral that is in most ultra-processed foods, or water, which is in probably 100% of ultra-processed foods, right? So it's a logical leap from a constellation of changes to pointing to one change, often coming from information that people are receiving from podcasts or from blogs, and so that they then fuse their experience with these ideas that they're getting, and they arbitrarily focus on one element among 300 elements that change, right? So it doesn't mean it's wrong. It's just very unreliable heuristic process, very confusing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, cool. So you were listing off what is proof, and you were essentially reeling off things that are not technically proof, and you were sort of working towards what is proof.
Right.
If we're saying that first P is, okay, someone's made a claim, what is the proof? What do we mean by proof?
Right. So yeah, examples of things that will often be brought up, but that are not really compelling anecdotes. Another one I see, this one's a little more gray, saying that a food is a source of nutrient X. And this goes both ways. Sometimes it's used to condemn a food. Sometimes it's used to recommend a food. And the reason I say it's more gray is that this isn't necessarily, this could be evidence-based and it could be reasonable, but it gets used and abused. And so what I would alert to is people be cautious when that is the essence of the argument. The pillar of the argument is that the food contains nutrient X. Again, it doesn't have to be wrong, but just perk up your ears, right? If there is the reason, I mean, we both know that the type of evidence that you want to be looking for is what we call outcome evidence, are the actual health effects of eating a certain food or not eating it, or eating higher amounts versus lower amounts. This is ideally what you want to base your beliefs on in your choices. So arguments like, well, this food contains this vitamin, or this food contains that nutrient, so we shouldn't eat it. A lot of times those are misleading and can be completely off with regards to the outcome evidence. So just a little bit of caution is what I'm saying.
Yeah, so that almost comes back to understanding the sort of hierarchy of evidence. And so, that becomes a little reductionist if you point to a food and you say, look, this food is, and I'm just making this up off the top of my head, is a great source of protein. But that food is associated with increased risk of cancer or increased risk of cardiovascular disease. You're sort of, missing the forest for the trees there.
Yeah. Great segue. That's the next P. We'll just jump to the next P, which is exactly stands for pyramid, and it's precisely referring to hierarchy of evidence. Because once we go past that first barrier of proof and we have some proof shown, evidence is not all created equal. So all studies do not weigh the same. And so hierarchy of evidence, if you go on Google Images and you Google that term, you'll see a lot of pyramids because that's usually how it's represented. And the way it usually looks is that at the bottom, the lowest rung is usually mechanistic evidence, and that's things like experiments in lab animals or cell culture or test tubes. So things that are not in humans, they're in surrogate systems, so-called surrogate systems. Above that, you'll have, then we get into the human experiments, not necessarily an experiment, but the human data, let's call it. And the lowest rungs of that are usually either ecological data, just kind of looking at a tribe somewhere or a population somewhere. Then you have case control studies. And then you get into the higher level evidence that is more robust, the cohort studies, the so-called epidemiology, even though epidemiology is a large umbrella, but the prospective studies. And then above that, you have the randomized controlled trials. And then above that, you have the large collections of data, the meta-analyses, and the systematic reviews. Another way, if this is too complicated for some people, we made a video. We wanted to make this even simpler. And so we made a video where we just showed people three bags of evidence. The first bag was mechanistic studies, so basically all the lab stuff and animals and test tube. The second bag was the prospective studies, the epidemiology, the observational studies. And the third bag was clinical trials. And that's in order of weight, let's call it. Mm-hmm. In reality, it's a bit more nuanced and more complex than that. Because a lot of times the questions you're asking with the epidemiology and the trials, it's not the same question, it's a complementary question. So really what you want to do, rather than this simplistic, we see a lot on the internet, people dismiss entire swaths of evidence and entire fields and entire experimental approaches. The reality, we look at everything, right? We look at totality of evidence, but then you need a system to rank it. Some things way more than others. So that's this idea of the pyramid or the hierarchy. Mm-hmm. So how would someone apply this to their daily life? If you see a surprising claim on the internet, is there proof? That's the first P. Second P, you want to walk your way to the top of the pyramid or to the heavier bags. So if you're shown a study in mice, okay, that's interesting data. We don't dismiss that. We don't pretend it doesn't exist. But we ask, cool, is there anything in humans? Does it align with that? If you're shown a study in humans that is observational, a prospective study, an epidemiological study, you go, cool, interesting data. Are there any clinical trials on this question or a complementary question, a related question? Do those things generally align? If you're shown a single clinical trial, you can ask, is there a meta-analysis of trials? Does it point in the same direction, right? So it's this idea of walking towards more reliable data.
I think the point you made about dismissing certain types of research, large sort of chunks of research is really important here, because often, depending on which sort of diet, tribe, or circle you might be caught up in, you might think about applying that pyramid, but then come across people saying, well, actually, this mechanistic study is more reliable because observational research is A, B, C, D, and they'll reel off their views of observational research and why it should not be seen as valid. So do you want to quickly sort of cover, you mentioned there that observational and randomized controlled trials are complementary. Why are both of these forms of studies important, and what are some of the important things for people to be aware of when thinking about these studies?
So the two most common mistakes I see with epidemiology in the internet discourse are, one, giving it too much weight, and two, not giving it enough. And we see these all the time. And interestingly, a lot of times the same person is making both, just on different days. So we see this all the time. People, an inconvenient epidemiological study is dismissed because epidemiology is weak. And then a week later, an epidemiological study that supports the belief is touted because it supports the belief, right? So we want to be very careful. It's a natural human tendency. We all have that bug in us to favor the data we like, but we have to be very careful with that and try to be as consistent as possible with the heuristics. So why don't we just dismiss epidemiology? Because there are questions that you can't ask with randomized controlled trials. You can't ask if smoking leads to lung cancer over 30 or 40 years with a randomized controlled trial, because you can't randomize people to smoke and then follow them for 30 years. It's just not doable, right? And trans fats, another example that also comes from epidemiology. There are many findings, trans fats and cardiovascular disease, right? That connection. There are many findings and many things that we now take for granted as causal even, that either started with epidemiology or to this day are largely rooted in epidemiological findings. So they're complementary because the general idea on the internet and certain circles of the internet is that epidemiology is useless and randomized controlled trials are this perfect experiment framed in gold and, in the Hall of Fame. Both of those are misconceptions. The reality is epidemiology is extremely important and useful, but it has blind spots. So that's why we interpret epidemiology in context of the totality of evidence. You don't do a logical leap from an observational study in the vacuum to, okay, there's causal relationship. That's a mistake. But the same is true about RCTs. They have lots of blind spots and caveats, especially when you get into nutrition, for example. The longer the RCT, the more it looks like an epidemiological study. The more you have to rely on what people tell you they eat, for example. One of the problems that's pointed out, one of the caveats of epidemiology, right? The relying on self-reports, the food frequency questionnaires. Well, when you're looking at a randomized controlled trial that goes on for years, you have to rely on what people tell you they eat. With some exceptions, historical exceptions where people are trapped in a certain place in mental hospitals or something. There are some examples like that. But in general, most RCTs that are not a month or two long, that are longer, you still have to tell people what to eat, but then you have to ask them, are you eating what I told you to eat? And you have to rely on their report. Sometimes there are other mechanisms. You can measure serum markers and try to correlate, but you can do that with epidemiology as well. The point is just that no experiment is perfect. And these things cover for each other's blind spots. Just like a randomized controlled trial isn't really doable for 20 years, by and large. The epidemiology covers that. With the RCT, you're typically limited with the sample size. The epidemiology is very good at that. But then the epidemiology has some weaknesses, and that's where the RCT is strongest. So it's like using, you don't use a hammer exclusively to build a house. You use different tools depending on the exact task at hand. Here's the same thing. You look at all of the evidence, and where these different experimental approaches align, where they give you generally an answer in the same direction, that's where our confidence is strongest. That's where we start to think it's a fundamental fact of nutrition or public health or whatever it may be.
Something that comes to mind here that I often see is this idea that correlation is not important, and that with epidemiology there are so many variables at play that this relationship could be due to something other than the kind of exposure that we're looking at. And you mentioned there that epidemiology does have certain limitations, but what is it, researchers that are conducting this type of study are aware of those limitations. What are they doing to try and mitigate some of the effect that other variables, other than what you're looking at, could have on the data?
So just a note on the correlation, because this is thrown around a lot. Correlation does not equal causation. With a randomized controlled trial, you're also looking at a correlation. It's a correlation between being in the intervention group and having a certain outcome. The fundamental difference is not the correlation. The fundamental difference is that in the randomized controlled trial, in theory, you are controlling for more variables and you have one thing that changes. In theory. In nutrition, it ends up rarely being the case because it's very difficult to run a placebo-controlled food experiment. Some exist in the literature, but that's not the norm, right? The norm is a replacement. And so you already have some issues there. You're replacing something. So is it the thing you removed, or is it the thing that you introduced? People know generally what you changed. Again, there are exceptions, but in general, in nutritional experiments, people can tell that it's not the same food. So are there psychological aspects? If you're giving somebody a healthier diet, are they going to go exercise more because they now feel galvanized and feel, encouraged by this partial healthier change? Is that going to motivate them to go exercise more, stress less, smoke less? All possibilities, right? So to your point that the investigators are the people who are the most familiar with these shortcomings. I talk to people who run RCTs for a living, and they understand that these are concerns. And I talk to people who do observational studies for a living, and they, better than anyone, understands the limitations. So some of the ways you can get around it, you can do multivariate analysis, right? You can try to statistically adjust for differences, things that could be potential confounders or different mediators. So, for example, if we're looking at two populations that eat more of something and less of something, and if they also one happens to smoke more, the other happens to smoke less, you're going to introduce that into your statistical model. So you typically in these studies, you have the raw data, and then you have a number of models that adjust for increasing numbers of variables. And in the last model, often is model number 3, you adjust for the most. And this is one way that you can distinguish a higher quality, more robust study, is the number of factors that they introduce into their multivariate analysis, because a robust study that's worth its salt is going to adjust, in nutrition particularly, is going to adjust for 10, 15, 20 factors, right? It's going to adjust for smoking, it's just for its BMI and sex and age and geographical location and socioeconomic differences in education and other dietary differences aside from the thing you're testing, other diseases, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one mechanism of confirmation. At the end of the day, the best mechanism of confirmation, and this goes for all of science, is reproducibility. Reproducibility within an experimental approach. You want to see that result reproduced by different teams of scientists across different institutions, across different countries, across different cultures, and that's when you know this is probably something robust. And you want to see it reproduced across disciplines, across experimental approaches, right? That's what we're talking about with the totality of the evidence. So when you see the arrow is pointing in the same general direction, whether you're looking at epidemiology, whether you're looking at RCTs, whether you're looking at mechanisms, whether you're looking at different types of epidemiological, of observational, or different types of RCTs, you consistently keep getting an answer. That's the highest level of confidence. So that's what it's all shooting for.
And was that the third P? So you've got proof, you've got the pyramid.
Yeah. So we got proof, pyramid. The third P is preponderance.
Preponderance. There we go. Proof, pyramid, preponderance. So before we move on to some examples and we can kind of walk through this system and apply it, which I think will be really instructive. One other question I have about epidemiology, and this often comes up, I see you mentioned smoking, and I see people comparing nutrition epidemiology to smoking and saying, well, how about we look at the actual risk? And this sort of brings me to, I guess, how we think about risk. And often people are saying, well, the sort of relative risk in these nutrition studies is so small. It's so much smaller than smoking that when you factor in that there's likely to be some other variables that could be at play here, is this really meaningful? Do you have a kind of view on that?
Yeah, it's a valid point, but it misses the big picture. It is true that if you're looking at that, many studies in epidemiology, the more detailed you get with the epidemiological approach, typically the smaller the effect will be. So if you're just asking, do people eat more or less do people drink more or less milk, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're trying to isolate that one question. And you have all of these other moving pieces nutritionally that you're trying to isolate. So you wouldn't expect that to be this 5-fold, 10-fold difference in outcomes from a single food. The comparison to tobacco, it's not really a parallel because you're comparing somebody who smokes to somebody who doesn't smoke. And here, you're not comparing an entire dietary pattern versus another completely different dietary pattern. That would be a fairer comparison. Mm-hmm. So the more specific the question, usually the narrower, the less dramatic the effect is going to be. If you look, for example, at the effect of dietary patterns, I mean, I can give you examples. The Lyon Heart Study saw a 50 to 70% reduction in CVD. That's over 2-fold reduction in cardiovascular disease, number one cause of death in the world. So, yeah, because they're looking at an entire dietary pattern, right? And then if you want to add more lifestyle aspects to it, you can compound that even more. But so it's logical that, that if you're just looking at one pixel, yeah, the effect is not going to be as impactful as if you're looking at the entire dietary pattern. If you compare somebody eating a really clean Mediterranean diet to somebody eating just the worst standard American diet for a long time, yeah, you're going to see some dramatic differences with the population. But if you're just looking at everything matched, and this goes back to this idea of reductionism, right? Which is how scientists a lot of times will ask the questions, and there's a reason for that, and it's not wrong to do it, but we have to keep in our minds that you are asking a very specific question. What is the effect of this one pixel in the diet? Yeah, you wouldn't expect that to be a 10-fold difference in cancer rates if you're looking at 5% of the diet, right? The other questions are contrast of exposure, like how different is the intake? A lot of times in these studies, depending on the populations, you're looking at relatively small differences. Mm-hmm. And so you wouldn't expect to see a big difference also. If you compare somebody who smokes 10 cigarettes to someone who smokes 12 cigarettes a day, you don't expect to see a huge difference in lung cancer. So it's the same logic. So yeah, it's a valid point. It's something to think about, but it doesn't really hold, and it doesn't really apply to nutrition as a field.
Yeah, it's a good point. You're saying, that the degree to which that risk is meaningful is somewhat dictated by the degree to how different someone's diet is. And if we're just talking about one little component, then we need to think about that risk in the context of cumulative risk and making lots of little changes to someone's diet. What is then the overall change in relative risk, which then comes back to your point of looking at more dietary pattern levels and comparing those.
The other qualifier there is that this idea of relative risk to absolute risk, that's going to hinge on the base rate of the disease. So if you're talking about a disease that is very common, like cardiovascular disease and atherosclerosis, usually the relative risks will actually reflect large absolute risks, particularly if you're looking over the lifetime. But if it's something that's less common, if it's like bladder cancer, even if you see a 50% reduction, the absolute risk reduction is not going to be impressive. But that depends on how prevalent the disease is. It's not a measure of the effectiveness of the intervention, right? So we just have to all of these approaches are valid and have a place. We just have to understand what we're saying and understand what we're applying.
Okay, so speaking of applying from here, what I'd like to do, if it's cool with you, is go through a few of the topics that we often see on social media. You've kind of spoken to a couple of them already, where people seem to arrive at, rather confidently at very different conclusions. And we'll put this sort of framework, the 3 Ps, into action. 3 of these examples that I'd like to go through are specific to foods or categories of foods, cooking oils, red meat, and eggs. And then the fourth is cholesterol levels and the relationship between cholesterol in our blood and cardiovascular disease, which is, of course, always a hot topic, especially on Twitter.
We're not going to have friends in the morning after we go through all of this.
Yeah.
We're going to piss off everybody.
All right. Well, yeah, let's see how we go. Let's start with oils here. And you have spoken a little bit, so we can kind of go as kind of as deep as you want to here, or as surface level as you would prefer. Every day online, we see people suggesting that all cooking oils should be avoided, or at least that seed oils should be avoided. I'd love to just know first your view of cooking oils. If someone said to you, Gil, if I cook with oil, is it going to harm my health? What would you say?
Well, it depends on the oil, but usually I see this question of the oil. The claim is usually broader, is that seed oils are toxic, period. Now, sometimes now we're seeing this narrower, this more specific claim that is just when you heat it up. And I think that's good news, because that's the progression that's a natural progression. The idea first pops up is very general, and then as people share more and more data that seems to go against that belief tends to get narrow and more specific. But I still, the vast majority of the time, I still see the belief and the claim is that seed oils are toxic, period. Even unheated, even just consuming them as salad dressing. And by the way, to be fair, I think there's a pattern. I don't know exactly what it is about oil, but every dietary quote unquote camp seems to have a pet peeve with oil. And we've seen this historically. It used to be the whole food plant-based low fat camp that had this thing headed out for olive oil, and olive oil. You'd hear people say olive oil causes heart disease. And that seems to have gone away a little bit. I hear that a lot less. And now it seems to have transferred over to more the low carb, high animal food, origin foods, with the seed oils, the liquid oils, but they sort of leave out the olive oil. And I couldn't tell you where these beliefs start, but once they start, they seem to spread like wildfire. And there's like a snowball effect. And now I now have people daily, and they mean it. You can tell they're genuine. Very emotional, very strong, deeply held belief that these oils are nasty, that they underlie every disease of the Western world. And so, okay, let's
question.
Yeah,
a little question. Sorry to interrupt, but do you feel like sometimes the reason that this can become emotional is that we all love to feel a part of a community, and these communities have certain views that are widely held within them and can be held by leaders, and it can challenge our identity if we come across information that is directly challenging one of these very strongly held views from within that community that our fellow community members also hold.
I think it's absolutely at least a part of it. It's not, if not the main factor. I absolutely see this. This no longer becomes an opinion or something that they're looking for. It becomes, exactly as you said, a part of their identity. Because when you question it, even if you're not taking it, if you're not doing carrying out a personal attack, you're not. It's not an ad hominem, and it's nothing like that. You're just sharing evidence that goes against that belief. You can tell that they are. It's personal to them. They're very emotionally invested in this belief. So I have no doubt that that's a factor. The belonging to these communities becomes a stronger factor. And again, I see this with every diatribe. The belonging to that community and the aligning with the values and the beliefs becomes almost more important than the actual behaviors and the actual the facts or the evidence that may underlie these beliefs. I think that's clearly a part of the equation.
So if we walk through your framework that you've outlined and we think about oils, what do we find, and where is it? Where do you think those that are taking a position that seed oils are toxic are perhaps going wrong, other than the identity side of things? If they are looking at the evidence and are confused by the evidence, where are they perhaps getting a little tripped up?
So to go with the order, those P's, the first one is proof. A lot of times when I ask people for more background on why they hold this belief, they will give us some of the examples that we gave initially. So they'll bring up an anecdote. We already touched on that.
Mm-hmm.
I eliminate all processed foods, and so seed oils in the processed food must be the culprit. Another one I see a lot is this appeal to nature, the idea that because they're not natural, and this also applies to olive oil for people who hold the belief that olive oil is also not beneficial. There is this general belief that foods that are natural are good and foods that are processed are bad. Of course, there's a nugget of truth to that, and there is a trend, but there's just too many exceptions. There's a lot of things that are natural that are horrible and even lethal. And there's tons of things that are at least lightly processed, that are somewhat artificial, that have good health outcomes. So the heuristic, although I understand having that rule of thumb, it just doesn't work when you apply it rigidly to every question. So those are some of the things, the storytelling, rather than compelling evidence.
Yeah, I guess the degree of processing could be enough to kind of raise an alarm, so to speak, and get you to go and look for more evidence. But as you say, it's not enough on its own to put a line through a food and say that it is inherently harmful because it is processed.
Yeah. That it must be, the processing must make it unhealthy. One argument I've heard is that oils are the fat equivalent of refined sugar. So with refined sugar, what you're doing is you're taking a plant and you're excluding the fiber and you're excluding all these wonderful nutrients, and you're just taking the pure refined carbohydrate. And that with oil, you're doing the same thing. You're excluding the fiber and all these other things, and you're just taking the fat fraction, the lipid fraction. But that doesn't follow from that it's harmful. You could theoretically extract the fat fraction out of a food, and it could remain just as healthy as the original. It could make it worse, or it could make it better. If, for example, hypothetically speaking, if the fat fraction is a health-promoting fraction of that initial food, if we had, I don't know, take almonds or whatever you want, right? Soybean. If the fat fraction is health-promoting, and if you're purifying it, you could end up with a more powerful health-promoting food. And if some of the other components are either neutral or negative, even if the net effect is positive, by purifying the positive and getting rid of the neutrals, you could end up with a healthier food. So there's no reason why purifying or excluding must derive an inferior product. There's no real alternative than to look at the outcome evidence, at the actual health effects of consuming the food. Now, if we had no data, if no experiment had ever been conducted on people eating olive oil or safflower oil, if we had to go with these guesses, well, our ancestors didn't eat it, well, it's processed, so maybe let's not risk it. I can see the appeal. But when we have hundreds of studies pointing in the opposite direction, that just makes no sense to replace those with a speculation based on it's processed, it's not natural. So maybe I should go over just briefly the evidence that we do have. So for olive oil, real quick, we'll start with the epidemiology. We'll go to the RCTs. There's lots of epidemiological evidence over the years pointing to benefit. Just to cite very recent ones, there's two large analyses from the Harvard School of Public Health that came out in 2020 and 2021. They're kind of complementary, and they came out in the Journal of American College of Cardiology, JAC, for people who want to look it up. basically across the board, intake of olive oil associated with less cardiovascular disease, lower inflammatory markers, less mortality, including all-cause mortality. And interestingly, they didn't see a statistically significant difference in the substitution analysis between olive oil and other plant oils. So these quote-unquote seed oils, suggesting that their effect on health is about similar. Then randomized control trials. We have a plethora of randomized control trials doing isocaloric substitutions and looking at lipid levels of cholesterol, looking at metrics of glucose metabolism. In general, you see an improvement, particularly if you're comparing the olive oil to concentrated sources of saturated fat. Then we have randomized control trials looking at outcomes. So we talked about Lyon. In Lyon, the main source of fat was olive oil and canola oil. And they saw the 50 to 70% reduction in cardiovascular disease. How do you reconcile that? It's, like we said, it's a change in more than one factor. But how do you reconcile a massive reduction of cardiovascular disease with these oils causing cardiovascular disease? It's just very difficult to reconcile the two.
You'd have to take the position that the rest of the diet was so beneficial that it offset any negative benefits of the oils. Right. But the other thing that comes up there, Gil, and sorry to interrupt your train of thought here, is in this one I see more from the whole food plant-based community is, hey, Gil, I'm hearing you that these studies are showing improved health outcomes with greater consumption of olive oil. And you speak to the randomized controlled trial, the Lyon study, but compared to what? And would a diet be healthier if those fats were coming from whole foods like olives themselves or nuts and seeds?
Well, lucky for us, Lyon is not the only randomized controlled trial that looked at this question. Predimed was a similar experiment, except they had two intervention arms. They had the high olive oil and the high nuts, right? And then they had a control group that was low fat. And both the olive oil and the high nuts groups had roughly similar 30% reduction in CVD. So again, I'm not saying it's a perfect experiment. I'm saying it suggests at face value that the two are about equally health promoting. And there are other studies. We're talking about the RCTs because these look at outcomes. So they're at the top of the pyramid. But there are other studies that look at substitutions and just markers. And I've never seen clear, consistent evidence of superiority of a whole form of fat over these oils. Now, obviously, oil is optional. It's not an essential food. So if you prefer to eat, almonds and avocados, I don't see a problem with that. That's fine. Personal preference. Or if you say, I'll just play it safe and I'll do this, fine. But we don't have to get to the point where we're making pseudoscientific statements that oil is toxic and, if you eat oil, it's going to damage your health. That's not based on evidence. So the evidence doesn't dictate behavior. You take it or leave it. You do with it what you want. And you can have a healthy dietary pattern with or without oil.
Hey friends, I hope you're enjoying this episode so far. A quick message from one of our sponsors who makes this show possible, and then we'll jump straight back into things. If you're familiar with my nutrition philosophy, you will know that I'm a huge believer in plant-rich diets being better for people and our planet. You'll also know that I frequently draw attention to what I describe as nutrients of focus. These are nutrients that science shows plant-based eaters, whether plant predominant or exclusive, can fall short in, which can leave you feeling run down, lacking energy, experiencing brain fog, and generally just not as vital as you'd like to be. For that reason, together with Emil, a plant-based health and wellness company, I formulated Essential 8. Essential 8 is your one-stop multi-nutrient, formulated with DHA, EPA, omega-3s from algae oil, vitamin B12, iodine, vitamin D3, iron, zinc, selenium, and calcium to perfectly complement your plant-rich diet. I personally take Essential 8 every morning with breakfast, just 2 capsules, much easier than supplementing with these 8 key nutrients individually. What's even more convenient is I have a monthly subscription, so it turns up automatically on my doorstep and I never miss a beat. To get yours, head to theproof.com/friends. That's theproof.com/friends, where you'll find a link to purchase Essential 8 that will get you an extra 5% off your first order on top of the significant subscription discount. There will also be a link to this in the show notes. Okay, back to the show. What if someone is thinking, well, I've read Dean Ornish's study or Dr. Esselstyn's study, and those diets were oil-free. Isn't that evidence that excluding the oil is going to be the better path forward for someone, particularly with cardiovascular disease?
No, because they didn't compare that to a group with oil, so we don't know. We know that they had good results with those diets. Those diets had plenty of things going for them, right? So it shows that you can get some good, particularly the Ornish study shows that you can get some good results with that type of diet. The Esselstyn trial, it's not a trial, it's a report. It's harder to interpret because there's no control group per se. But certainly those diets have a lot going for them. They are devoid of junk food, of ultra-processed foods. They are rich in fruits and vegetables. They are not crazy high in saturated fat and salt and added sugars or alcohol. So they check most of the boxes. What we can't do is make a statement about the health value of oil with a trial that doesn't test the effect of oil. It's just not informative for that particular purpose. So it's possible adding oil, it's theoretically possible that adding oil to that diet would make it worse, or that it would be a lateral move, or that would make it better. Maybe you could get even more spectacular results with the oil. I don't know for a fact. Based on everything we have, I would guess that it would either be a lateral move, not much difference. In some people, it might benefit them depending on what it replaces. The unsaturated fats in some of the substitution analysis have a strong beneficial effect, a stronger effect than some of the forms of whole carbohydrate, depending on the outcome and depending on the study. But my guess would be you wouldn't see a big difference.
So why is it that you think, I guess, mechanistically, that some people do hold the view of, based on what you just said then, and I agree with your position on that, why is it that some people do hold the view that, well, from a mechanistic point of view, these oils seem to be or may be affecting endothelial cell function and therefore cardiovascular health. So I think it's the best approach here is to proceed with caution. Where has that idea come from?
Well, there are some studies, namely some postprandial studies looking at flow-mediated dilation, right? FMD, this measure of function of the artery wall. Now, I don't know to what extent people are rooting their belief on those findings versus how much is back rationalization from the belief to then producing these data when asked for evidence. But leaving that aside, that's very, very, very weak evidence. That's mechanistic evidence. We talked about the pyramid. That would be close to the bottom. In fact, there are many changes. There are some forms of exercise that acutely cause a deterioration of flow-mediated dilation. Phases of sleep cause a deterioration of flow-mediated dilation. In some studies, sexual activity causes FMD to go down. So the key here is that they are acute changes, postprandial or post-activity, that don't necessarily reflect the long-term elasticity of the artery wall or cardiovascular function as a whole. And in fact, there are some meta-analyses of RCTs showing that people who, when you introduce olive oil, their long-term FMD actually tends to improve. So I think the caution here, and this is a great example of not being confused, of not dismissing pockets of evidence, but of looking at that in the context of everything we know. And when that happens, when you take a step back and someone tells you, okay, after you eat olive oil, your FMD, by the way, this might also depend on the type of olive oil. Extra virgin might not have this function. There are some data that suggests that. But based on this pocket of evidence, then taking the step back and looking at everything we know, how relevant is this? Is this does this reflect long-term data, the long-term physiology? Does this reflect actual outcomes? Even if FMD was a reproducible effect, a deterioration of short-term or even long-term FMD after eating olive oil, and this was really robust and reproducible and specific to olive oil, none of those things check out. But even if we had all of that, you still have the good outcomes. You still have lower cardiovascular risk. You can't get around it. One thing supersedes the other.
It's a giant leap to kind of make, and you have to dismiss a lot of evidence to get there. Another one that I've heard that's quite a good example, or I think it's a good example, I'd love to know your thoughts on this, is that speaks to kind of acute changes not always reflecting chronic changes and overall risk, is changes in blood pressure during exercise.
Exactly.
And if someone exercised and you just were looking at their blood pressure and it was going up, you, without looking at any other evidence, but understanding the mechanisms of cardiovascular disease, you might come to the conclusion that exercise is actually harmful for cardiovascular disease, when in fact we know that exercise reduces overall risk of cardiovascular disease.
Exactly. So I think the overarching point with all these, that's a perfect example. The overarching point is that we shouldn't assume that isolated observations reflect the systemic effect of a food or a intervention of any kind, right? And this is an extremely common misunderstanding. People will point to, a component of the food that in a lab experiment thrown on cells in cell culture has a detrimental effect, and they'll say, therefore, this food is toxic. Well, you're taking a massive logical leap from the effect of a single nutrient, isolated and concentrated, ex vivo on cell culture, to speculating what the global effect of the food in a living, breathing human in a systemic manner is going to be. And those leaps, more often than not, don't pan out. That's why mechanistic evidence has to be taken with a huge grain of salt.
Is that where these kind of ideas that polyunsaturated fats are unstable and easily oxidized and cause inflammation? I see this quite a bit. This is probably more the sort of rhetoric in the seed oil or the anti-seed oil community. Is that where that comes from, this idea of these unsaturated fats easily oxidizing and oxidizing LDL particles as a sort of way of trying to explain why these are harmful?
Yes, mainly that's coming from mechanistic evidence, and there is some evidence that indicates that if you deep fry the oils, like I was reading this paper the other day, deep frying an oil like 20 times repeatedly, and then you observe some increase in the inflammatory markers. So it's not that we're saying that mechanistic evidence is irrelevant. We're saying you have to look at it in the context of everything else and realize that if you have an outcome-based experiment that points in the opposite direction, there's no way you can't, it supersedes the mechanistic evidence. You can't just run with this biochemical pathway. The inflammation is another big one. Seed oils are inflammatory based on a supposition that, well, it's a fact that omega-6s will generally activate a pathway that has some inflammatory role. So we'll increase, at least in theory and in vitro, will increase the production of arachidonic acid, and that will increase the production of the synthesis of some pro-inflammatory factors. The problem is that can be correct. And then when you look at the systemic effect in the individuals, in living, breathing humans, you can have many other effects of the food that make up for it. As it turns out, that effect doesn't even pan out very well either. So although this is observed ex vivo, then when you look at people consuming linoleic acid, the most common omega-6, there's little to no variation in arachidonic acid, even when you vary linoleic acid by like several fold. So it seems that the production of arachidonic acid is fairly constant and is not influenced that much. But also there's other levels of complication where the same pathway also leads to the biosynthesis of factors that are anti-inflammatory, right? So the bottom line here is you have to be very careful with the logical leap, because we are trying to guess what the full picture is by looking at one pixel, right? You can look at a pixel that is white, and you can say that pixel is white, and I'm 100% certain of that. And if you're only looking at that pixel, you're going to be misled as to the full picture and what the color is, right? So we can't say the picture is white because I've looked at a pixel and it's definitely white. And that's what we're seeing with these logical leaps with the mechanistic data.
Mm-hmm. Have to be able to zoom out a little bit. The next question I have here before we move on to red meat, which we might tackle next, and I think this speaks to the third P, the preponderance of evidence. Sometimes when I see people talking about the harms of seed oils and polyunsaturated fats in particular, I see them point to a few single randomized controlled trials like the Minnesota coronary experiment or the Sydney diet heart study. And these are randomized controlled trials. As you mentioned before, people see these as the gold standard. So if someone was working through the evidence, they might come across this and then be very quickly confused, and find it difficult to kind of form a position with so much contradictory evidence. You spoke just before about the Leon heart study, which came to different findings to these two randomized controlled trials that I'm mentioning here. What would you like people to understand kind of about these trials? And I guess this is just one example, but how does this come back to evaluating evidence overall?
So there's two approaches to that. One is more specific, and it's to look at the specific methodology of those trials and the shortcomings that explain those results. But I would just talk about the exact same process that we've been reiterating throughout this whole conversation, which is to step back and look at all of the evidence. And when you do that, and you look at large meta-analyses of all the available trials that did substitutions of saturated fat for other foods, you see that the overall effect is towards benefit of replacing saturated fat with more unsaturated forms of fat. And for example, if you look at the Cochrane meta-analysis of 2020, there are, I believe, 15 RCTs meta-analyzed, and the trend is towards benefit. And then you see that Sydney is a complete outlier. It points in the opposite direction. So this observation alone doesn't explain why that is. It doesn't prove that Sydney is wrong. Sydney could be right and everything else could be wrong. But the minute you step back from just knowing about Sydney because that's what you heard online somewhere, and thinking that that's the totality of the evidence and that scientists are clueless, to stepping back and seeing this full picture with 14 out of 15 trials either being non-significant or beneficial, and then the one trial you were shown pointing in the opposite direction, that's a completely different reality. Right there, that's an important epiphany, right? Then if you want to understand why it's an outlier, then you can go into these details. Sydney is one of the few trials where people were advised to replace the saturated fat with foods that contained a pretty high content of trans fats. Not because the trial was sloppy, but because this was conducted in the 60s and the 70s, where this wasn't understood. Now we understand that when you replace saturated fat with trans fats, it actually tends to worsen cardiovascular outcomes. So in light of all this, it's an outlier. It's one of the few trials where people were told to eat a food that is rich in trans fats instead of saturated fat. It makes sense. Now, even knowing that, we don't dismiss Sydney. We don't go, okay, pretend that doesn't exist. No, what we do is include it in the totality of the evidence. When we look at the full picture, include it in the meta-analyses. That's what the Cochrane did. They didn't rule it out because of these methodological issues. It should also be pointed out that there are concerns about trans fats in many of the other trials of the Oslo and others, right? Sydney is not the only one that has concern around trans fats. although it is the only one that told people to go eat a food that was rich in trans fats. But so you look at everything. You put the studies together, and you look at the full picture. Preponderance, the last P, right? The third P. Minnesota is generally similar, but Minnesota was basically, it's even more obvious because Minnesota was well designed in general, but then the policies nationwide changed, and these were inpatients at a mental hospital. So it had a lot of potential because you have people living in the facility and being fed whatever you're serving. You have a lot of potential for rigor. The problem is the policies changed, and a lot of these patients went home. They were no longer inpatients at the mental hospital. They were discharged. And so the trial ended. The trial was aborted, effectively aborted. And the investigators didn't even publish the data. So the vast majority of the outcomes are not significant. It was projected to last, it was either 3.5 or 4 years, around there, the full follow-up. And the average follow-up was 13 months. When they had to pull the plug and abort the study. So the fact that you see non-significant outcomes is precisely what you would predict from a study that is aborted a third of the way in. Right? That's not surprising. It's not confusing. And then there are other issues. There are many technical issues with Minnesota, but I mean that would be the main one.
Yeah, that's probably a podcast in itself. And I think Alan Flanagan, he was on the show previously. I think he may have spoken about a few of those. Just to sort of tie a bow in oils, what are your recommendations? Someone listening now, listen to all of that and is thinking, well, yeah, I would like to include some oils in my diet. Are there particular oils you like people to focus on?
I'm usually conservative on the recommendations. I like to discuss the evidence. I like to show people the evidence, and then I like to let people make their own decisions based on the evidence that we've discussed. But I don't see evidence of clear superiority, and I've looked at this, actively looked at this. I don't see evidence of clear superiority of olive oil over seed oils, of seed oils over olive oil, of whole forms over these purified forms. So my recommendation would be, do what you like, and the best diet is the diet that you can sustain over the long term and that supports your long-term health. So under this umbrella of a health promoting dietary pattern, there's enormous flexibility. If you really enjoy olive oil, I would never tell you to not eat it. If you enjoy canola oil, I would never tell you to not eat that. If you prefer to leave those aside and prefer almonds and avocado and olives, and I would never tell you to go put some oil into your diet. I don't think there's evidence to back that up. So there's a lot of wiggle room. I don't think there's a clear recommendation towards one of those options. I think they're all, as far as we can tell, one could be better, but it's not obvious from the available evidence.
And from your view, are there any circumstances where you do feel that exclusion of oil is beneficial?
I wouldn't say exclusion, but I would say that the caloric density of the oil, the caloric density of any type of purified fat is obviously higher than the caloric density of most foods. Now, this is sometimes used as an argument to tell everybody that they should avoid oil and that oil is a harmful food. I disagree with that. I agree, however, that is a factor to bear in mind as you design your strategy. So for some people, reducing the amount of oil is definitely going to help them maintain a healthy body weight or lose some or trim down. But for other people, some people lose weight on a diet that is high in fat and high in oils. So it's all about the total amount of calories. And if your strategy, if a diet high in fats with oil helps you stay at reasonable calories, then that's the right diet for you. And if a diet that is lower in oils and more moderate, because if you have the oils, you go overboard and you eat too many calories, then the right diet for you might be moderate or even absent in oils. So I don't think there's an absolute there. I think it's impossible to give people an absolute rule that is accurate and evidence-based.
Although sometimes the absolutes are a little more sexy.
Oh,
It might make the headlines a little more often.
definitely. It's definitely a lot stickier. It's easier to remember. I know all that. This is an ongoing conversation with the YouTube videos, and but I mean, I'm always going to tell people what I see in the evidence. If I change my mind, I'll tell people. If it's not the sexiest message, I don't really care. If it doesn't make a lot of friends, I got enough friends in real life. All joking aside, the reason I started the videos is that there was too much diet content on the internet and not enough nutrition content. And that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to make videos that just told people what what the evidence was and didn't push them to do low fat or low carb or to do intermediate fat. Just show people the data and let them make their decisions. I think that this is crucial in scientific communication. I could be wrong, but this is my approach. Treat people like adults, discuss the facts, and let them make the decisions.
Yeah, I'm certainly with you on that. That's what I really appreciate about your approach. Let's move on from cooking oils. I should
real quick, since you mentioned cooking, because this is important. Some people do make this distinction that maybe seed oils are fine, but it's when you cook them that you run into an issue. And I've looked specifically into that, and there's a lot less studies that specifically look at heated oil. But the ones I found, and I was just looking at some this week, the ones I found again consistently point to benefit even of seed oils used for cooking. There are some Chinese cohorts looking at a bunch of these oils used for stir frying and deep frying, and they still point to lower all-cause mortality and just better outcomes, particularly when compared to the more animal-based, like lard, which is another common cooking fat in these parts of China. So I'm open to this all of this being wrong, but all the evidence I see points in the same direction. And I keep asking people, and I never get a cogent argument to back up these beliefs. So, so far, I haven't seen it.
Okay, beautifully put. What about red meat? This is another very polarizing topic. On one hand, I'm throwing you in the deep end here. I'm gonna.
Not everybody agrees on this one. It's not. No, there's no discussion, no arguments and fights over this one.
On one hand, you have the World Health Organization and their position on red meat and cancer, and there are various studies associating red meat with cardiovascular disease. And on the other hand, various studies suggesting that this science is weak, or reviews suggesting that this science is weak, and that red meat has been unfairly vilified. And that in fact, it's not red meat that's to blame for rises in chronic disease, cardiovascular disease, cancer, etc., but it's the increased consumption of ultra-processed foods and industrial seed oils. I'd love to know what your top line thoughts are about red meat, and then let's walk through where you think some of this confusion lies.
So I think there's several aspects to this, but first, briefly, let's touch on this idea that there are many studies to back up every opinion, right? That's true. You can find a study to back up almost any view, but that doesn't mean that the science is unclear. It doesn't mean that the experts are confused. What it means is that we don't derive overarching scientific conclusions from individual studies. We look at totality of evidence. This is a crucial mindset shift. So when you look at the totality of the evidence, you see that neither of the artificially polarized opinions on meat is evidence-based. You'll hear people saying red meat is toxic. Doesn't matter how much. It doesn't matter what else you're eating. If you're eating any red meat, you're damaging your health. And you'll also see people saying this is all vegan propaganda and red meat is just a health food, period. No matter how much you eat, no matter what else you're doing, it's good for you, or at least neutral for you. Neither of those positions is really can be justified based on the evidence. what we see fairly consistently is that there is a threshold of effect, particularly with CVD and with cancer, with colorectal cancer. And that threshold seems to be around 100 grams per day average consumption, average intake. So usually when you look at studies comparing people, say, eating 20 grams a day average to people eating 60 grams a day, you don't see much difference there. You see this, for example, with studies from Asia, from Japan, right? And so when people, understandably, when people look at this and go, see, in this study, the people that ate the most red meat didn't have more disease. So this whole story is just a lie. You have to look at the details, right? You have to look at how the different pieces of information fit together. Okay, that's a study looking at low, very low compared to a bit less low consumption. Then you look at studies that cross that threshold, say people consuming 50 grams a day average to people consuming 150 grams a day average. And there you tend to see the difference in outcomes with a higher rate of CVD and a higher rate of colorectal cancer with the highest intake.
That's such an important point, is if we're talking about a certain food or an exposure, what is the contrast in that study between the two groups? Because as you're speaking to here, if that contrast is not sufficient, because high and low can mean many different things in different studies, right? It's relative. They're relative to one another. And you spoke earlier about cigarettes, but just to kind of use that as another example here, that would be like perhaps looking at a population of smokers and comparing those who smoke 7 cigarettes a day to 9. And if you didn't find a significant difference, you may, from that study, if you're not looking at the totality of the evidence, you may be inclined to think that smoking is not increasing risk.
Right. And it's when you look at things with that information in mind, you realize that studies that are seemingly contradictory really aren't. There is no contradiction, right?
They're just different studies.
If they're different ranges, it's not a contradiction. At face value, it seems like it is. Here's a study where people eating more red meat had more disease, and here's a study where they didn't. Contradiction. But when you look at the full information, there is no inherent contradiction. It's just a different range of intake.
I think that's because there's this idea, this very sort of binary view of foods, good or bad, and there's not that appreciation for threshold.
Yep. And linear effect, absolutely. I mean, we see this with everything. We see this with cholesterol. If cholesterol's bad, how come nature put it in our bodies? It's not that it's bad. It's when it's too high that it raises risk of disease, right? So it's very understandable. We see this with the vaccines too. Oh, if someone who's vaccinated can get the virus, then the vaccines don't work. It's an oversimplification of something that could be a rate. You could be 10 times less likely to get the virus. The vaccine could be working amazingly, and yet you can find people who are vaccinated who get it. The fact that you find exceptions doesn't mean the thing doesn't work. It's because we have this tendency of oversimplifying into all or nothing, black and white. And the effect in our minds, the effect is supposed to be linear. The more you eat, the higher the rate of disease. And sometimes you see that, but sometimes you don't. With cholesterol, that's another common one, right? It's a plateau at a fairly low range. And so that confuses a lot.
Dietary cholesterol.
Yeah, dietary cholesterol. Does eating cholesterol raise your serum cholesterol or not? People can't get a straight answer. People are pulling their hair out over this because the effect isn't linear. It's extremely confusing. But once you show somebody the graph once, that there's a linear phase and then there's a plateau. And so if you're looking at the phase of the plateau, you can vary the dietary cholesterol all you want. You're going to see very little difference in serum levels. And if you're in the linear range, the opposite happens, right? So the key here is not to know all these facts by heart. The key is just to realize that when you step back and you look at the full picture, things that are seemingly contradictory a lot of times are not. And in fact, they show you how things work. They are different pieces of the puzzle that fit together to show you that full picture.
You kind of expect people, Gil, to get into these studies and look at the Asian cohorts and the American cohorts and look at the amount of grams of red meat that each group is comparing and try and make sense of this? Or do you think this is where guidelines become important and sort of reviews of the evidence that other people have performed?
I think there's a place for everything. There are people who will go the extra mile. I have viewers in my channel that are not scientists, but they are incredibly diligent and curious, and they will fact check. And I love them because they will fact check my videos and they'll say, "Hey, you said something over there. Isn't that really?" And they'll go to the study, right? And I'll go, and sometimes I have to go back and I go, "Okay, yeah, it is accurate," or "I shouldn't have said it that way." So there are people that will go the extra mile. Understandably, a lot of people, probably most people, don't have the time to go read 500 studies to figure out what's for dinner, right? They have other things to do. And so there is a place for committees of scientists coming together and giving people the bottom line. There is also a place for people who are trying to do what you and I are doing, which is to bridge those guidelines and bridge the evidence with the public. Because a lot of people are not satisfied with just being given directives and not being explained why things are the way they are. This generates a lot of dissatisfaction. It generates a lot of distrust. When people are just told, we see this with the pandemic as well, when people are just told, here's what you're going to do, and not explained why that is, it creates a gap of trust that is then filled.
Like if we take this red meat example, if you were simply saying to me, eating red meat is increasing the risk of cancer, and then I saw someone else saying the opposite, that wouldn't leave me with enough information to actually make an informed choice. But if I'm sitting here listening to you and you're explaining why there are different findings in the science, and you are explaining this threshold and how these studies are coming to different findings, that is very empowering. And I can see how useful that is as a kind of bridge. So that's a great point.
I think it's absolutely indispensable nowadays because this isn't our grandparents' generation anymore. People aren't happy just taking orders from some central organization and carrying them out. People want to know. I think people just want to be treated like adults. People want to be shown the information. People want to be shown what to do, and then they want to be left to make their own decision. Right? But in order to make an educated decision, we need to have access to a certain amount of information, to a certain level of information. Otherwise, it's not an informed decision. So you raised a very important question, which we should touch on, which is this idea of the confounders. Everything we've said so far could be just that people who eat more red meat smoke more and exercise less and are more overweight, et cetera, right? How do we know? What indications do we have that that's not the case? I would point to two lines, and we've already touched on this, the two types of confirmation that we have, the two levels of confirmation. One is within the experimental approach, so within these observational studies, the multivariate analysis. So when you look at really good cohort studies, really good prospective studies, they will adjust for all these things. They will adjust for BMI, they will adjust for smoking, they will adjust for exercise, they will adjust for other dietary components. And if the effect survives those statistical adjustments, your confidence level goes up. That it is less likely that it's just that people smoke more.
And when you say adjust, if someone's hearing that for the first time, essentially what you're saying is that rather than comparing a group of people consuming high amounts of meat with a group of people consuming low amounts of meat, where there is big differences between them in terms of their body weight and how often they exercise, you're removing that so it's an even playing field. You compare someone who is the same body weight and has the same level of exercise but has a higher red meat intake versus someone with lower. Is that right?
Well, sort of. You're statistically asking, and for the technical details, you're going to have someone who does epidemiology. this gets really nerdy really fast, but the bottom line is you're asking what part of the effect is mediated by the variation in BMI versus what part of the effect is mediated by the variation in red meat consumption. And you can do this with reasonably high degree of confidence. Now, again, as always, this isn't all or nothing. This technique is crucial. It adds a level of confidence to epidemiological studies. Nowadays, no epidemiological study without multivariate analysis would even be taken seriously. Does it give us 100% certainty? No. Is it possible for confounders to not be completely adjusted for? Yes. Is it possible for some confounders that the investigators didn't think about to be present? Yes. So it's all about degrees of confidence. It's all about you trying to plug as many holes as you can and move up that ladder of confidence. And so this leads me to the second mechanism of confirmation, which goes beyond just trying to make the epidemiological study as tight as you can. Well, there's an intermediate level, which is to see if it's consistent, right? You see consistency in epidemiological studies, highest quality possible, across institutions, across investigators, across populations. But then you go beyond that technique. And just to put this into context, we know that red meat raises ApoB. We should probably give people the gist on what that is. ApoB is a marker of lipoprotein, of a family of lipoproteins that carry cholesterol in the blood, and specifically the atherogenic lipoproteins. So you could think of it as buses carrying passengers. Like cholesterol and other types of fat are transported in our bloodstream by these lipoproteins, these vehicles. And a family of those vehicles is labeled by this tag called ApoB, and it's that family that is atherogenic, that causes atherosclerosis. So we know, and so the crux, the causal crux for heart disease is not cholesterol as it is often thought, but it is the concentration of these ApoB-carrying lipoproteins in the bloodstream. We can get into more detail on that if you like, if we have time. But we know that eating meat, red meat, raises ApoB relative to other alternatives that are lower in saturated fat and plant protein, for example. We know that eating saturated fat raises ApoB relative to, for example, unsaturated forms of fat, and red meat is proportionally richer in saturated fat than many of the alternatives. We know that ApoB is causal in cardiovascular disease from a swath of evidence. We know that reducing saturated fat across a specific threshold, and again, if you replace it with a healthier alternative like unsaturated fats, reduces cardiovascular risk. And so when you put all of those findings, and in the background of that, you now observe that people who eat more red meat above a certain range also are more likely to have cardiovascular disease. That's a very different context than just an isolated epidemiological observation, right? So this is what I mean by looking at all the evidence, and this is what scientists do to arrive at a likely health effect of a food. Again, it's not 100%. Nobody's 100% sure, 100% mathematical that red meat causes cardiovascular disease. Nobody's 100% sure that tobacco causes lung cancer. It's just a very high degree of likelihood based on the consistency of the evidence and the magnitude of effect and all these other factors. And so it's just degrees of likelihood. It's like stacking the deck in your favor, really. What this is doing is you're walking into the casino with the game slightly stacked in your favor. The more information you have, the more stacked it is. If you walk in completely naive, you're going to lose your money sooner or later, right? And the more you stack the deck, the more you favor, the more the odds favor you, the better odds of success you have. This is similar.
And what about cancer and the mechanism, the likely kind of mechanisms there that may explain why there is an increased risk of colorectal cancer in particular with red meat consumption?
Yeah, similar story, right? So you look at the epidemiology. With cancer, it's actually a little harder, the causal inference, because with cardiovascular disease, we have all of these other experimental approaches pointing in the same direction. We have these randomized controlled trials. We have the things looking at saturated fat. We have the markers. With cancer, it's harder. You basically have the two pillars. You have the epidemiological association, and then you have the mechanisms. The heme iron, the heterocyclic amines, all these components that are thought to increase risk of cancer, that are thought to increase mutation rates. And so it's based on those two that you infer causality. It's the same type of principle. I would say that the degree of certainty is a little lower with cancer than with cardiovascular disease. If I had to put a number to it, I'd say that it's a little lower. But in most cases, I think it is overwhelmingly likely that this is the case, that red meat increases risk. It's not the only food that does it. This is another source of confusion, right? Sometimes there are other changes in the diet, and people look at countries, for example. Oh, this country, people eat more meat, and yet they live longer. There are other factors that affect health and longevity and even cardiovascular disease. In order to be pretty confident, you have to isolate the variable as much as you can. So I think our degree of certainty is quite high. It's certainly high enough that I'm comfortable making decisions based on that. And the other thing to say is that what experiments haven't been done that could be done? You can't run a randomized controlled trial comparing someone eating nothing but steaks to someone comparing nothing but beans for 40 years. You can't do that, right? In a metabolic ward, isolated from the world, so everything else is controlled. It's not doable. So you're never going to have that level of an experiment done. So you have to make decisions today for dinner based on the evidence you have.
Yeah, that point you make about comparing different populations and some of the issues with that is a really, really good point. And I think it's an important one to land here is that because there are so many other variables, often when you're looking at a component of nutrition, it's going to be much more reliable to look at differences within the one population. For example, with Hong Kong, you mentioned there, I would love to know within that population, if you look at high and low red meat consumers who have the same access to public health and live the same lifestyle, is there a difference in health outcomes?
Assuming you have enough contrast of exposure, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that would be a much better question than comparing Hong Kong to another country. Because there are so many variables. And to tie this back to the hierarchy and to the pyramid, the depictions of hierarchy of evidence that show ecological data, that's usually pretty low. It's among the lowest in human data. And it's precisely for this reason. There are too many variables that you can't really control for.
Yeah. One that pops up quite a bit is the Pure study.
Sure.
And we don't need to go into the details, but I think some people will be familiar with it. And clearly socioeconomic status is at play with some of the results there.
Although to be fair, Pure would rank higher than than these observations of Hong Kong, because Pure is an epidemiological study, and they do have adjustment models, and they do have quintiles of consumption. So it is a rung above above ecological data, about these country comparisons. But yes, it contains some concerns regarding socioeconomic status and the contrast of exposure with saturated fat as well. There are some concerns there as well. But yeah.
What would you say, Gil, if someone said the studies that you're speaking to here about red meat are not looking at the type of meat that I eat? If someone eats grass-fed, non-industrial, lean beef, are they immune from these risks that you're talking about here?
I wouldn't make that leap. No, the mechanisms that are the most compelling, saturated fat. I mean, we know causally at this point, both from metabolic ward marker studies and we have the outcome data. Saturated fat is going to be a major determinant of cardiovascular disease in particular. So if the grass-fed meat is leaner, maybe it's better. Otherwise, if it's the same, I wouldn't assume that it's healthier. There's no, again, the burden of proof is with the person making the claim. And so for me to go for a product that is a variant of a product that has so much data pointing to harm, And to believe that that product is now going to be fine, I would need to see evidence that consumption of grass-fed meat specifically is neutral or beneficial. Outcome data, I haven't seen it. I've seen some studies with markers and with composition, and actually they are not very promising. Some of the markers actually look worse with the grass-fed. It's a very complicated case to make. I would, based on the evidence I've seen, I would not bet any money that grass-fed red meat is going to be substantially better outcome-wise. For the animals, probably. So if you care about animal welfare and you're choosing between grass-fed and grain-fed calf meat, sure, that might be an argument. Probably better for the animals that the way it's raised. It's a bit of storytelling, really. We don't have compelling evidence showing better outcomes with grass-fed, unfortunately.
Yeah, and there is, when it comes to, I guess, lean meat, there's that study you sort of alluded to or spoke to earlier. I think it was Bergeron et al. That compared the lean red meat with white meat and also with plant protein, and the lean red meat still relative to plant protein increased ApoB. Right.
That's the Krauss study, right? Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, Krauss was involved in that. Yeah.
Right. Well, I mean, it's basically going to be, again, you're looking at all these different factors that influence an outcome. Even if your chicken is leaner, let's say you're looking at chicken breast, it's going to be leaner than red meat. And by the way, clearly white meat has better outcomes in the evidence overall than red meat. Nobody's denying that. So sometimes you'll see people oversimplify and say, well, they're all the same. They're clearly not. White meat clearly has better outcomes. So replacing red meat with white meat would be expected overall to be a net positive. But you're still looking at all these moving parts. Does it have less saturated fat? Okay. Where does it sit in the spectrum? It could be less saturated fat than red meat, but still be more than beans or another form of plant protein. Cholesterol content would be another one that we briefly touched on. Fiber is another dietary component that will affect your lipid levels. So it's only when you put all of these together that you get the net effect. And that's probably why you see that. Even there's a study that's really provocative by Chris Gardner at Stanford, and they look at two diets that are matched for saturated fat, matched for cholesterol, and then the only difference is that one has more whole plants and the other has more kind of processed plants. And the one with more whole plants still lowered lipids more, cholesterol, LDL cholesterol. So it's kind of like it's a wake-up call that even when the major dietary factors are controlled, you still have other players in the mix. And really the net effect of a food is what you're looking for. The systemic effect with all its components, right? A lot of times the whole is more than the sum of its parts.
That overall food matrix.
Based on that, probably good to mention, maybe as a last point, depending on how we're doing on time, based on this idea of the whole dietary pattern, above whether there's red meat or not, above whether there's eggs or not, whether there's oil or not, the main thing I would like people to take away from this is that the whole dietary pattern is the main concern. If your entire dietary pattern as a whole is health promoting, whether it includes some red meat or not, whether it includes some eggs or not, whether it includes some dairy or even some butter, that's secondary, right? So you want to, because of these discussions a lot of times, and I think I'm guilty of that as like anybody else, we tend to go super deep and we forget that it's the full picture that counts. Hope that makes sense.
Before actually we get to I guess, what that overall healthy dietary pattern looks like or can look like and the different kind of variations of it, I do have one last question on red meat. And this is your thoughts on TMAO. This is a kind of relatively new, hot kind of sexy biomarker that we're seeing used or measured in a few studies. What do you think about TMAO? Is it involved in the development? Is it causal in the development of cardiovascular disease, or is it just associating with cardiovascular disease?
It's a great example to put through the 3Ps, because when TMAO, the data started coming out, the 2010s, basically, a lot of data was coming out on TMAO and sexy data. And it was the new kid on the block, and TMAO was the new reason why animal foods are harmful. And the vegan community was, in a frenzy over TMAO. It was their darling. And it's a good example of something that had a lot of proof, a lot of robust studies shown. But then when you go to the second and the third piece, all of it was either mechanistic or observational. TMAO levels correlating with risk, TMAO doing this and that in different surrogate models. And the question is exactly what you asked: is it causal? And when that data came in 2019, if I'm not mistaken, the first genetic studies, the first Mendelian randomization studies came out, and they pointed to no causal effect. And to this day, that's all the causal data I've seen with TMAO points to no causal factor, no cause and effect. Mm-hmm. So it's a really interesting example of when you walk up the ladder, up the pyramid, and sometimes you got to wait. Sometimes the pyramid is missing the top rungs because it's being built, right? It's under construction. Mm-hmm. With TMAO, that happened. And then when those top rungs come, they might, mm-hmm. change the full picture. That's what happened with TMAO. So my guess is it's a marker. Mm-hmm. It's a marker of other things, but it's not causal. So if you just lower TMAO and don't change the root causes, probably doesn't mm-hmm. affect your cardiovascular risk. That would be my guess based on the causal evidence.
A little bit similar to the HDL story then. Okay. Well, I do want to leave some room, I guess, for a future conversation where we can pick up on some of these topics where we've left off. We had planned to cover eggs and go deep into cholesterol and cardiovascular disease, but I almost think that that's better carved off as its own episode. Before we do wrap this one up, the dietary pattern, I think, as you just emphasized there, that is really, really important for people to walk away with from this conversation. As interesting as going into all of the weeds is, and how informative that is in terms of just being able to make sense of the sort of polarizing opinions out there. As interesting as that is, it's great to know, well, next time I'm at the grocery store and when I'm feeding my family, what does this look like? What do you want to leave people with there?
Yeah. So from all the evidence available and from the highest standards of evidence, what we know is that the best diet for humans isn't a diet as the term is normally used on the internet. It's not the keto diet or the low fat diet or the paleo diet or the Jenny Craig diet. It's a pattern. It's a dietary pattern that's rich in whole plants, fruits and vegetables, and the different classes of whole plants in general, and that is not very high in ultra-processed foods. Crucial. That's the conducting thread. Everybody will agree on this. And that is not also excessively high in added purified sugar, salt, saturated fat, and alcohol. And then the same thing will apply to drinks, like predominantly water. Tea is fine, some coffee is fine, but not crazy on the sugar-sweetened beverages. Those are the rules of thumb. Now, important to say, that's very flexible. There's a lot of wiggle room. That dietary pattern can be molded into a omnivorous diet, into a low-carb diet, into a high-carb diet, into a low-fat diet, into an intermediate fat diet, into an exclusively plant-based diet, into a vegetarian diet, into most of these patterns that people talk about online. So there's no contradiction between doing low-carb or low-fat or high-carb or high-fat and having a generally health-promoting diet. There's wiggle room, there's flexibility.
Beautifully put. Thank you so much, Gil. This has been a really enjoyable conversation, and as I said, plenty of scope for us to build on in the future. I'm guessing a lot of folks listening are going to want to connect with you and listen to more of what you have to say. I certainly encourage them to do that. Where's the best place or places for them to find you?
YouTube would be the main thing that I'm currently devoting time to, and it's Nutrition Made Simple is the YouTube channel. And then on Twitter, it's interesting as well. The conversations tend to get a bit more in depth, and that's nutrition. So at Nutrition Made S3 is my handle. You can find me there, and we have a Facebook page as well. I haven't been putting too much time into that lately, but it's if you search Facebook for Nutrition Made Simple, you'll find our page as well. We usually post like the new videos that come up and all that stuff.
Amazing. I'll put the links to that into the show notes. Awesome. Thanks, Gil. Let's do this again soon.
Thanks, man. Thanks for having me. Take care.
Thank you for joining me for this episode and your interest in science-based conversation. I hope you enjoyed it and found the information covered interesting and instructive. If you did and you'd like to show your support for the show, please subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can stay up to date with new episodes and watch them in video format. Yes, the full-length videos. Please also consider subscribing to the show on the Spotify and/or Apple Podcast app, wherever you enjoy listening to podcasts. You can also leave a review on Apple or Spotify. Again, a great way to support the show and make our content more discoverable for others to enjoy and learn from. If you have any comments about the episodes, suggestions for future episodes, including guests you'd like to see on the show, or questions that you'd like to have answered, please leave those in the comments section on YouTube. I myself and my team will take note of these comments when planning future episodes. Finally, the best way to support the show and receive discounts on products we love is by checking out our sponsors at theproof.com/friends. Enjoy your week, stay well, and I look forward to catching you in the next episode.